Hello world of YouTube and welcome to Listening Log Update for August of 2025. I have 12 albums that I spun over the last month that I'm going to be talking about in this video, with time codes as always listed in the description for each individual review if you'd like to skip around in the video. There was a lot of stuff in August that dropped that I was excited for, some of which I had to push off for the September listening log. So there is a lot to comb through, and a lot of stuff that I was hyped for that finally came out, along with some stuff I wasn't wholly expecting, but was still equally as surprised for. So give it a like if you're excited, and let's go ahead and start diving in by talking about...
They plot my demise, I'm in new dimensions. Undefined, refined, it's a new invention. Remove your...
You know, I'm not necessarily wholly saying that JID is aiming for this sort of like discography length through line throughout his records, but I will say that having a record like The Forever Story that feels like a sort of maturation of the Never Story and almost sort of like transforming it into this rose-tinted elegant experience that still goes off, but like does so with such a swagger that elevates your artistry to another level. I don't think that God Does Like Ugly solidifies that ideology. I do think that it sort of like is very much just in the now, but even in that same breath, the pull away from the elegance back into more grittier production and very much more like bass rattling production in some instances, very much at least presents an interesting dichotomy and expansion on some of those more elegant ideas from The Forever Story. You know, this album isn't all just heat and sinister bangers, but that definitely is the MO, and even some of the attitude that sits beneath some of the more ballad-esque moments still at the end of the day. You know, yeah, it starts off gnashing with You Ugly, one of a bevy of collaborations on here that absolutely kill it, but the West Side Gun collab on there just creates this mood of aggression that I think he and JID just have this great chemistry on. But on Glory, sort of like comparing the industry to the eye of the storm, so to speak, and his place within it before getting direct with it with the Calypso collaboration on Community, where he's just feels like he's all anarchy on his attitude toward everything that's happened in the industry over the last year, but still gets tongue-in-cheek with it by having clips on the song. But it's like, it's a great collab. Like, it's another great collab. I feel like this is just, obviously, it's been a great year for Push and Malice, and I'm happy to see them thriving. And getting to do shit like this, I think they do great on here. But, like, even, again, the moments where some of that more mellow vibes still have that underbelly of not necessarily sinisterness, but just sort of aggression in a way that, like, still cuts deep. Like, Vince still sounds as Vince as ever on VCRs, but, like, he helps ground the song with his verse, and I love it. But, like, Ciara and Earth Gang on Skate, yeah, it's got still, like, Ciara doing a great hook and some great background vocals, and Earth Gang's flow is much less on the Can't Punk Me level, but, like, the lyrics themselves, they got, like, a real sort of, like, observant undertone to them that I think add to the mood of the record up to that point in its own really nice way. The back and forth between JID and Jesse Reyes on No Boo also has that kind of attitude, but, like, obviously in a little more of, like, an intimate realm. And I think that, like, that through Of Blue feels like a great showcasing of, like, the album sequencing honestly being choice by and large, but I think that that's a stretch where, like, it really excels at, like, carrying the listener through mood while also just having some really great verses and use of sort of subject across that to sort of tie it all together, help go into this back and forth with the listener, and absolutely love it. The word flipping and wordsmithing on K-Word feels like the type of stuff that, like, really would entice people who loved the Eminem collab from the Prelux that I almost reviewed on the listening log but didn't. I think that's a great batch of songs, and I think that, like, I get why none of those songs ended up on the album, but I think they're a decent batch of songs. But, like, this record, as far as, like, having some of that, like, more wordsmith worship is still there in other pockets, but K-Word is, like, the absolute apex of that, and it's a great penultimate fiery jam to help round the record out before Four Keeps does the more sort of, like, very of its ilk, nice mellow finale to send the album off into the sunset. Really lovely production, and helps sort of like give things a nice punctuation. I think this is a great listen. As somebody who loved the Forever Story a hell of a lot, I don't know if it necessarily hits the same, but it gets close. And I think, like, especially considering how dense the past couple months have been for rap, this is a record that, like, I think still stands above a handful of things that I've spun, and I think it is a still fantastic release from JID. I'm giving this an 8. I think that it's really good. And I think that as far as JID reaffirming that, like, he really is a guy that can pull the world together, and as far as being a reflection of the now, it does all of that with the same kind of fiery wordplay that I've loved from him, but I think does a good job at pivoting that sort of like sound back into something a little more gritty to help enhance that mood. I'm gonna manifest this happening IRL, but Anamanaguchi are playing in Indianapolis in October, and they're melding the emotional core of Anyway with the bright and chipper sounds that fill their discography behind it. And I think that their attempt at just blending those ideas in practice on this album makes for an incredible spin. I would never expected Anamanaguchi to go full vocals, but I think that the lyrical tapestry in particular on this record really adds some weight beneath that chiptune brightness that still permeates throughout parts of this, but lets the rest of the band sing just as strongly beneath those vocals more so than the rest of their catalog. I think this album is absolutely stellar. Songs like the lead singles Darcy and Magnet lean into more of that optimistic edge with these huge guitars that let that pop and pop rock sound and their influence shine bright. Those are some Weezer-inspired cuts in the best way, and I feel like as far as adorning an influence like that in this day and age, and pulling it off like that is a spectacle in and of itself. But I really enjoy how there is a more sense of sorrow and frustration festering underneath that optimism that I'm more interested in on this record, especially given the band's past catalog. Songs like the pensive Sparkler that talks about bursting out into the further frustration stewed throughout Rage the Kitchen Sink, I feel like are as much the heart of this project as that brightness. The synth sounds on Sapphire very much are still giving video game, but that sadness that rings out in the chorus and that emptiness hits just as hard. It is very much an evolution of a sound that has been evolving for the last 10 plus years, but takes that big step in a way that could have easily failed them. And I think just excels so strongly. I absolutely love this album. I love the production. I love the explorations of this emotional sort of back and forth that comes throughout in the lyrics. And I think that it is a stellar release. And easily one of my personal favorite rock albums I've spun this year. It is very much getting high marks for me. It's like an 8 if not a 9 for me right now. I think that this album is stellar across the board. For a band that spent so much of their career being loud and upfront, I think that they channel that noise into some good emotional cores strongly here. We can tell by the way you tune it out. The way you tune it out. I have been waiting with bated breath for Jer to follow up Bothered Unbothered. Easily one of the best albums in its lane, and I'm not just talking ska, I'm talking like punk adjacent, two-tone adjacent. Like, that spirit is like some of the best in its lane, and I think Death of the Heart takes that foundation and that real overt politically charged lyricism and improves upon it tenfold. Something that, like, it was already a high bar to pass, because I think Bothered Unbothered was one of the best of its year, and I think it's just aged like wine. And the way that this triples down a lot of those ideologies while also upping the sort of songwriting style and album construction style into making a more interesting listen in tandem with fortifying those beliefs, I think makes for a really delicious cocktail of a listen. I love that it talks about trying to be better than getting swept up in the negativity, you know, being unbothered, so to speak, but finding yourself rounding the bend to bothered so easily before just stewing in being bothered for a lot of the runtime in a way that I think is in the similar light to what I talked about in the Redacted of being the change, advocating for the change you want to see in the world and loving that message. That's really the core of this, and why I think I love this so much, and why I love records in recent months like Chromacopia and the like. The fact that it goes from I'm Still Bothered into The Way You Tune It Out as like a marching call to those to stop tuning out the noise and really paying attention to it, I think is like a smart sequencing point and a really good ignition switch for the fiery emotions beneath the record to really get capped off. It even takes a sort of catty look at those trying to turn a blind eye on the song following up the Laid Back Couldn't Be Me. Easily my favorite song on the album, because it's the kind of response that you give to those that act shocked in the face of, like, the same tragedies that the world faces literally on the daily, and sort of showcasing one's own cathartic numbness to it and just still wanting to change, to see a change for that, to not be the norm. It even goes deeper against that in ways that it skirted the lines of on Bothered and Bothered, but goes whole hog on it. Like on Capitalism Breeds Devastation and Cult of the Lonely. Two bangers, in my opinion, where they really look at the political landscape and the landscape of the country we're building toward and just spitting in the face of it in the truest punk fashion. This also, like any great record, in my opinion, has this real A and B through line that has that ebb and flow intensity that I really think most artists should aim for, but I think JR really accomplishes. Because you have this opening stretch of really going against the norms of turning a blind eye or tuning it out to speaking out against it before really getting to the nitty-gritty of what they are, like, speaking out against, before really trying to turn the emotional sphere into advocating for a point of growth within oneself, really taking a look at the world, digesting it, and learning from it to change one's perspective, or to really fully realize one's own beliefs, instead of just stewing in this ecosystem of half ideas or half investigations into ideologies. It even has a point to really sort of take that knowledge and that passion from into the offline world and just making it one's own part of themselves, so to speak. You know, trying to bridge the world, so to speak, even if there is an opposition between two people potentially. You know, trying to find the commonality in giving perspective. And I really love that about this album. I think that JR really pulled together a masterclass in writing politically charged music that tries to advocate for change while also being well-rounded in its viewpoint. I love this album. I think it's absolutely a smash. I think that if you love ska music, if you love politically charged music, JR's Death of the Heart is a place to go. Easily one of the best I've heard this year. This is absolutely getting a 9 for me. Like, it is no, maybe hum-ha, could be. No, it's easily one of the best of the year so far, in my opinion. I absolutely love this album.
Case still won't solve them. The judge said what? I don't see no problem. The world said yup, that's the Negro problem.
Look, I was not as mean to The Big Day as a lot of my contemporaries were. Hell, I still, even upon revisiting it, and may not like it as much as I did when it first came out, still think it's far from, like, even the 100 worst albums I've ever heard. That being said, when Chance was teasing a comeback last year, it got me pretty excited. Because I do still spin a lot of my faves and a lot of the highs that I think he's dropped in his career thus far in a relatively hefty rotation. I think he's a good personality on the mic and can come with some bars when he really wants to. Hell, I was even working on a Best Chance Features video in the Hip Hop Feature Versus series that I hope to drop before the year's end to celebrate this Chance-a-sance. That being said, on the other side of Starline, do I think it matches those highs that I still love to revisit? Not quite on a full scale, but he does come pretty damn close. Tracks like Ride, The Negro Problem, Back to Go, The Highs and Lows, and even Tree, which is a weed banger with Lil Wayne and Smino, all have moments and bars that really give us a glimpse at the Chance that we all fell in love with, and I think really do a lot to elevate and reaffirm Chance's, excellence as a writer. Hell, Gun in Your Purse and Drape to Mania also see him evolving those highs into a modern sense better and more gracefully than they were attempted on The Big Day. Hell, even Burn Your Block showcases that a Kanye influence can still smack in 2025 if it's done by the right person. It doesn't have Mr. West anywhere near the fucking track. There's some spots where sure he kind of like diverts off and maybe the track as a whole doesn't necessarily add a whole lot to this hour-plus track listing, like Space and Time or Link Me in the Future. That's a real middle point of the record where it feels like it sort of slows to a crawl. I could have done without the J Electron song, not just because of his verse, but I think Chance is really trying to punch in a realm that doesn't quite hit as hard as some of the other points on the album, in my opinion. And admittedly, I don't think Speed of Love is the best closer in his catalog. But I will say, by and large, this project has more hits than misses in a way that I'm actually going to give this the same score I gave The Big Day back in the day, but I have retroactively lowered my score of The Big Day because I think that if we're talking about a real 6 out of 10 in Chance's catalog, Starline might be a better showcasing of that. Because it is solid and has some points of showcasing, again, Chance's true excellence, but it kind of overstays its welcome ever so slightly and makes me feel underwhelmed upon repeated spins. Some really good stuff on here, though. And I feel like if you like Chance, this is the kind of comeback I feel like a lot of his fans were really waiting for.
Life getting too wild, everything is passive. Oh shit! You be living in the nightlife.
In the wake of Don't Tap the Glass, I expected more party rap albums to come to light. I wasn't expecting it to happen so soon, though, in the lights of Hyperyouth, the newest Joey Valence and Brae project. However, I'm going to use this as an example to talk about an act transitioning ideas not as gracefully as others in their lane. Because there's a real MO to this project that feels very similar to some of Don't Tap the Glass, especially in the veins of just letting loose on the dance floor and getting hype. But like that album, this album has some underlying problems it wants to bring to light, but I feel like it's those moments where it feels like it's trying to sell the dance party atmosphere as a subversion and less a focus. And unfortunately, because the songwriting has to be the real carrier for those emotional moments, the songwriting doesn't quite hit the same benchmark as their, like, really hype shit that they've built their career pillaging forth on does. I think that, like, the album starts off on a foot that feels very all too familiar, in a good and bad way. The beats on tracks like Give It To Me and Bust Down in particular very much capitalize on their career thus far. Bust Down in particular sounds like the most Neptunes-inspired song that wasn't handled by somebody who directly works with Pharrell that I've heard in a hot second. I love the beat of that song, and I love the beat of Give It To Me. The same can be said for some of the other beats with collaborations that happen on here, like What's Up with JPEG Mafia, or some of the sample flipping on tracks like The Party Song or Go Hard. They do good at paying tribute to dance music while also keeping the energy high. But to pivot it back to that Peggy collab, that is the end of what I would say is a sandwich for where I think this record shines and falters so gracefully in a nice little package. Because I love the collaborations with Rebecca Black and JPEG Mafia. I think that they are a good showcasing of those highs, especially in the case of the production on See You Dance and What's Up being some well-produced jams that in the case of See You Dance do kind of toy with them skirting their sound in a different world, but they bring it all down on Party's Over in a way that I think is maybe some of the best in showcasing what that could be, but even it is sort of a far cry from some of the highs I've already praised. And I feel like the focus on those moments, like on Have to Cry later on in the record, undercut some of those hype moments. Like Billie Jean before it feels so underwritten, which for these guys is saying something, but it feels like that song is more to be a placeholder, to be a sort of heart drop moment afterwards with Have to Cry that just sort of makes the song feel wholly unimportant in the grand scheme of the track listing. I ultimately am not walking away loving this thing as much as the other two, but I do really like a lot of what's going on in the sonics of this. I just think that they really gotta work on their lyrical craftsmanship just a bit if they want to make those emotional moments hit hard. It feels like it's very much spinning in circles in some regards. I'm giving this a 7 because it's not like horrible. It's very solid. But in the echelon of this group's discography, I think if they want to stick the landing on the next one, they've either got to go whole hog and doubling down on an emotional intensity, or foregoing it altogether and just making an even more well-crafted batch of bangers. I know I wasn't setting up much hype for this review, potentially, during my redactive of the previous Rise Against album, Nowhere Generation, by saying I was not digging this as much as Nowhere Generation. But I was sort of set aback by how underwhelmed I was and how turned off I was by some of the production ideas and sonic tangents the band wanted to dabble into on this record. And I think that they were on a really nice upswing in the turn of the decade. I thought Wolves was a really solid album. Again, I liked Nowhere Generation enough to do a redacted on it because I do think that it is a solid album. But I do like my redacted a little bit more. And again, there's just some interesting sonic ideas that I just don't think this band taps into well or melds well with their own adaptations of like hardcore inspo funneled into alt-rock that they've been sort of like championing for the last decade plus. You know, they really sort of hammer in some of those alt-rock ideas more on one of the early album cuts, I Want It All, but the production on the drums on that song are not great. The production on the drums on this are probably some of the biggest jarring inconsistencies that create this weird sonic experience, so to speak. There's some songs where the drums just really sound kind of like ass. But like the almost marching turned mid-2000s post-grunge that happens on I Want It All left such a sour taste in my mouth. Almost as sour as like the acoustic noodling over electronic beats that was happening on the title track afterward, that even when they sort of threw in their more idiosyncratic edge, it wasn't saving it, in my opinion. Part of it has to do with the vocals, in my opinion. I don't know what, if anything, may or may not have happened to Tim McElrath's vocals between the recording of the Nowhere Generation or this, or it was a mic choice, production choice. But there's just something going on with his voice that I think was not an issue on any of their most recent albums. And it's glaring on tracks like Ricochet or on Black Crown, a song that really feels like it's trying to be their own version of like a Deftones jam almost, but I don't think quite hits the nail on the head because of the production. Something that I honestly think kind of happens on the new Deftones album, not to spoiler tee up some of that review. But there's a handful of moments on here where like, I don't think the vocals hit as hard, I don't think the band's cooking up some sauce that I think tastes all that good when melded with the other ideas they've got in the crock pot. Even in moments where I feel like they succeed in writing a solid jam, like State of Emergency or Sink Like a Stone, I don't really think they're the best version of like the band doing that. And I ultimately just don't think that this album is cutting the mustard to me quite as much. And I know like I feel like I'm shitting on a lot of this record, but I'm mostly just harping on the negatives. A lot of the things that I like or have any interest in are just sort of like the most meddling versions of what this band has cooked together in the past. So much so that I am giving this a 5. You know, it is equal parts not good as it is, like, relatively mediocre for this band. By the time this album is rounding the bend, it doesn't necessarily close out on anything horrendous, but I don't think it necessarily wows me and pulls me back into any investment in the same breath.
Something like time flies, we grow up with no warning, shake my head, say what?
Field Medic's ability to juggle spreading influences and the struggles that bring him sorrow and putting them on the page, I think, is one of his best talents. I've really admired his evolution of his sound from the lo-fi bedroom pairing of folk with some fun beat play into more inspirations of traditional roots in music, and even some synth offshoots that may not always hit, but when he brings them together, they can be a solid pop-driven jam. And on this newest album, Surrender Instead, we see him confronting the duality of embracing one's past and wanting to shut it out of a disinterest in it, with the continuous struggles he's faced the older that he gets, the back and forth on his addiction to smoking and how it's affected his life. Love is obviously a big through line throughout parts of this, and carries the catalyst on one of the absolute smashes on here, Simply Obsessed. A song that feels like it's sort of speaking on somebody's joy that you care about, but you're not actively the one bringing them that joy, so it's from a sort of distance, which has a sort of underlying pain to it, but that feels like some of the real shadows that sit beneath a couple songs on here. You know, the same feels like the case on Melancholy, a song about being unable to let go and dwelling in that sadness. Or, you know, even just the Confessions of Reaping What One Sows on the hook of Inferno. There's a whole feeling of acceptance in Misery beneath some of the brighter sounds on here that I think elevate it above where he sort of danced around over the last couple of records. And I like how some of those aforementioned sonic pivots, again, just further meld with things. Like the throwback groove on Melancholy is vintage, but handled so excellently. Again, Simply Obsessed adorns some of that synth embrace with the polish that I thought sort of bogged down Light Is Gone too, but lets it fit within this track listing a lot more seamlessly. There's a lot of mood to this, and honestly reminds me of a record of his I really love, Floral Prince, but it adds a lot of what he's done since then into the mix that I think helps elevate it to a level that is akin to that, but also something all its own altogether. I really like this album. As somebody who's really enjoyed Field Medic and a lot of his discography, I think this is another notch in that belt. I'm giving this an 8 out of 10. Absolute smash. Really enjoy it. If you like Field Medic and you like his brand of melancholic observations, this is another good batch of that belt.
Under the couch, a shotgun, 12 keys. Bow, another shot in the door flew open. Mega snow on the table of fiend.
I'm not going to spend this review comparing the Ghostface and Raekwon albums, but I will say I was not quite as excited for this album as the new Raekwon album, even if I think Ghostface has more albums that I like more than Raekwon albums, as mostly because Ghostface has been more prolific. These two records are trying to do different things, even if they're sort of released in this sort of like stretch of records meant to pay homages to hip-hop. Both do so in their own respective ways. While both dabble in Wu-Tang, obviously, it's only because they have shared roots. Raekwon's only on one song on this album, which is a whole conversation altogether. I just love seeing Ghostface and Raekwon together, and I think that on this album, we could have used a little more Raekwon. He's only on the trial, and I will say that, like, one of the things I think sets this record back is that it aims to get nostalgic, but doesn't go the full 9 with it. Like, it's got Fourth Disciple and Iron Man. You've got Redman on an intro, but he's not even on a song. Like, what the hell is up with that? The Trial is, like, the biggest waste of the jizza I think I've ever seen on a record, man. Like, I don't know. And not to say that, like, every collaboration flops. I think that Method Man on You, My Friend is solid. It's another moment that, like, gets nostalgic in a way that, like, I think works. I think the Nas collaboration is easily the best on this record. And even then, it's not even, like, one of Nas's best features. It's just a solid feature on a record that, like, is fine enough, if not a little set back by how underwhelming it really is at the end of the day. I think that the coke rap that's on Curtis May is, like, some classic Ghostface shit, and I think, honestly, hits with the Conway and the Styles P collabs. I think M.O.P. on Sample 420 is also a really solid early album cut. But there's this stretch of the record amidst, like, Windows and Beatbox, and even part of Breakbeats, but Breakbeats has a little more going on verse-wise, where, like, it just feels like Ghostface is sprinting through these ideas because they feel like part of the sort of mood board, but not necessarily anything he had as much to say as other things. And so the songs kind of see him sort of just kind of like waving past as he's going to the next subject. And like, I don't know. Those kind of feel like really half-baked. I also think that like other songs like Rap Kingpin, the lead single, is again just like mad underwhelming. While I think it's cool that they're wanting to do this stretch of releases to highlight a lot of old rappers still having their neck in the game and doing their thing. And I think Ghostface does deliver some verses on here. I honestly think his last record, Guns N' Roses, was a little bit better. I'm going to give this a 5, because it's not horrible. It's just very average. And comparatively to like other Ghostface records, especially if it's going to live in the shadow of what I've claimed is like one of the best Wu-Tang solo albums, and a lot of people have done so. This album even does so. I just don't think it really lives up to the to like those expectations, and I think that like Ghostface has definitely done better. He's probably done worse, but he's definitely done better. I've talked a lot about Swami Sounds back in the day over the last couple of years because it's a record that stayed pretty heavily in my rotation, and I've been waiting with bated breath for a follow-up record. So when he announced this collaborative album with Gum MP3, a producer that I wasn't really familiar with, I was still excited to see what sort of cocktail these two would pull together. What I wasn't wholly expecting was something that actually is a little bit more than just these two DJs working together, because there's a couple collaborative artists that come back for a couple tracks and other ones on pretty much every other song that create the sort of melting pot of sorts that I think makes for a really well put together series of back and forths in the realms of dance and electronic music. You know, because there's not only a good use of a dance atmosphere, there's some sample choices and synth choices that feel very much like homages to certain eras of electronic production as it's been in pop culture, like on the opener Pleaser, or throughout some of the synths on the more energetic portions of Strip Game and D-Foul. You know, the fucking loop on Black History has that sort of like early 2000s feel that I really loved about Swami Sound's brand of production in particular, when he does tap into that inspiration, and I think just goes the distance with a really simple drum flip. But in the same breath, you've got moments like Image of You, or the portion on Black History, or Second Time Around, where it sort of cuts out the energetic portion and you get some ambience and air. You know, there's a real ebb and flow to this that I think lends to a really fun respin every single time. I will say there's some songs where it feels like they get a bit too wrapped up in the cyclicalness. I'm looking at you, Strip Game, a little bit, and a song like Break It Up sort of toes that line, but even in that breath, those moments are few and far between. I think that the build-up on Second Time Around reaches this really lovely rush. And I think the use of turntablism on Youth Man is also pretty fucking choice. I like this album a lot. I think that it's another one of those records that very much hits a sonic realm that I'm very much a fan of, and it scratches an itch in music that I love getting scratched time and time again. It feels like the equivalent of like a beat tape you'd make with your friends, and I really enjoy that about it. I'm gonna give this an 8 out of 10. I think that it's a really fun spin, and I think if you love collaborative circles in music, you'll get a lot of love out of the stuff within this. If there's one band I have a relatively quasi-disconnect with its fan base, it's Deftones. I love the band. I've seen them live. I've got my favorite album of theirs on vinyl. But there's always some records that they have that I have a much more meddling opinion on, sometimes to a relatively intense degree. I will say I agree with the fans in one breath with this new album, Private Music. I do think it is better than their last two albums, and honestly, it's by a relatively decent margin. I think that Gore and Ohms were great upon release, but they've also fallen deep into obscurity with me as records that I just don't spin as much as the highs that I love in the band. They fall into the relative middle. I do think, for me, this album is going to land amongst that crop because it is better than the last two, but I still think it is a stone's throw from the other stuff that they've made with the producer of this. I honestly did not know that they were working with the same producer going into this album, and it's a little shocking to me that it is, because it's got components that I think are good, and honestly stand out for them as some, like, divergences in sound that I like seeing them dive more into, like the bass-laden groove of Ecdysis. I think that groove gives way to this nice punchy chorus, but even in that instance, I'll use that as an example of my personal beef with the record. The guitars on that song feel like they could hit so much harder. There is a flattening of the guitars on a lot of this record that I feel like lets a handful of its moments really not hit as hard for me. My Mind is a Mountain, I feel the exact same way. And it's what's supposed to start the record off on this frantic foot. And I think that, like, it is a fine enough single. I thought it was, like, alright upon release, but it and Milk of the Madonna just are not songs that I would rank amongst my favorites. I do think Milk of the Madonna sounds better in the context of the record, but that's because it is the bright explosion amidst the mellow I Think About You All the Time, which is one of, again, the album highs. It's a moment where those flattened guitars more give way to enhancing ambience and don't have to service being this sort of wall, so to speak. And one of the moments where Chino dips back into his rap-adjacent attitude on Cut Hands. I'll admit Cut Hands is a song that I also think could do with a retooling of its production to make it just hit harder, but it's an interesting divergence for them to take and dip back into. I think one of the few moments that everything does kind of hit the way that I feel like the band was aiming it for it to is on the Middle Point CXZ, though. I love that song. I think that song is the kind of wall I expect from them and was hoping to see more on the forefront of some of the intense moments on here. But the songs that are great on here are fucking mint. And even the ones that I don't necessarily like the production, I do like the songs. I just kind of wish they hit a little harder, you know what I mean? Like, I think Lot Club has that same kind of, like, just pummeling groove as Royal, but I just don't think it hits as hard. I could see myself keeping this in my rotation at least throughout the year and find myself finding songs that I do that do continue to stick out. And I could see this landing somewhere on my best of the year list, but I think that it holds itself back in ways that neuter some of the great ideas that are presented on the record. I'm giving this an 8. I do really like this, but I also gave Gore and Ohms 8s when they released, and I have since lowered those. So again, it's sort of one of those records that I could find myself loving down the road, but I also wouldn't be surprised if it ends up in the ambiguous middle of their discography for me.
You wanna go for a ride? Anywhere that you want to go, anywhere that the wind might blow is.
I didn't end up filming a full review of The Longest Weekend, the newest TWRP album, but in the intro that I did film and some of the extended thoughts, I talked about how genius it was for them to release this album called The Longest Weekend on Labor Day weekend, and it sort of feels like the great late summer relaxation that feels like the perfect inverse to some of the nose to the grindstone, grind set ideology that fueled parts of Digital Nightmare. They're seemingly like spiraling down the creative staircase. This album sees them from the jump, dissecting themselves from the worlds and sort of making an album about the moment. And that moment is one that sort of sees them showcasing when they pull off the utopian vibes that they champion on records like Return or Wherever. They can really concoct some concise, just really big jams. This album, honestly, it kind of feels like a handful of records that they've made into an interesting sort of different flavor of the same brand. You know, it's got some of the relaxing dystopia from this, while also having a bit more of a focus on some of the AOR ideas that they were really doing well on Over the Top. You know, Unbound and Free Party 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 feels like an elevated version of their Protoman collab, which I already really loved on its own merits from Over the Top, but has a similar sort of vibe, but has elements in it like its guitar solo and the like that just send it over the edge, while also staying within this relaxed, dissected vibe that a lot of this is sort of trying to push forth. You know, No Service kicks it off by abandoning your phone. I'm gone for the weekend. Nobody need me. And while, you know, letting that be the lead into My Big Day Off, the more bright, huge, catchy song to sort of celebrate one's own freedom from the working world. You know, getting to focus on things personal and sort of natural, like one's own projects that they're sort of nurturing, like on Starting From Scratch, or even something down to, you know, observing the bugs in your weekend getaway on Critters. There's also just a handful of moments on this that sort of just send their proverbial songs over the edge. I already talked about the one on Unbounded and Free, but the acoustic guitar solo on The Language of Love, oh my god, it's so good. The way that the synth funk melds away with this ambience on Stargazing is absolutely beautiful. Hell, when talking about sequencing, the fact that Stargazing is, you know, sending that synth funk out into the horizons, following two of the tightest funky jams on the whole record, The Nourishing Act and Day Trip respectfully, two songs that further just delve into the isolated relaxation and pure bliss, is just a chef's kiss moment. The fact that the title track sort of has this moment where it sort of fades out with this big brass sort of like ensemble beneath their funky grooves before having that come back in a very classic fashion just really helps tie all of these ideas that they've got going on into a bigger scope than they've really kind of toyed with on their last couple of releases. There's a unity across this track listing that I feel like has been something they've tried to do, but haven't quite nailed it quite like they have on The Longest Weekend. While I've loved every album that TWRP has released, this really feels like a new benchmark for them, and I like it for a lot of the same reasons that I love a record like Return to Wherever, but where that record really felt like them reaching a peak with their synth funk roots. This sees them really showing the growth and expansions they've made since this and bringing it to its own harmonious euphoria. I really love The Longest Weekend. I think it's some peak TWRP in the best ways possible, and I'm giving this a 9 out of 10. This is going to be like high on my end of the year list. I really enjoy this album as a lover of what this band does when they really pull it all together. I think this is like the best batch of tracks they've dropped since this, easily. And those are my thoughts on what I spawned over the last month. Do you agree with them? Do you disagree? Is there something I still haven't talked about that's been released this year that you would like for me to talk about? Leave all those thoughts in the comments down below. And if you didn't like it, again, make sure that you give it a like. And if you want to see more, consider subscribing. I drop 2 to 4 vids a week depending on what I've got going on. I've got the next episode. Depending on when this came out, you've either seen or will see the next part in this season of Roguelite run this weekend, and we'll have a new episode of Tony Hawk dropping next week. Thank you so much for joining me. I've been Viral Ranking as a good situations, and I'll see you another day.